What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today was an immense day for 10th edition Warhammer 40k. Not only did we get points values for every single unit in the new edition, and alongside all of the mission spoilers and indexes that we've gotten over the past week or two, we basically have all of the components to play the game, which is amazing. And in addition to that, we also have the last piece of the puzzle, which was the designer's commentary, which took a bunch of the questions and open interactions that were a little bit confusing within the core rules, clarified them, cleaned things up, and acts as both kind of a glossary, rules compendium, and reference guide. While some of the rules are written or formatted in kind of a casual tome within the core rules themselves, the rules in this designer's document are much more concretely worded. It's a good reference for exactly how a rule is meant to work, even if the core rules don't entirely specify. Now, they also give a ton of examples on how mechanics should work and diagrams and things like that clarify how mechanics are intended to interact on the tabletop, and in some cases this actually directly contradicts what the rulebook itself says, but this is the intention of the designer, so it is basically the newly correct interpretation of the rule from the core rulebook. So today what I'm going to be doing is going through the biggest changes and clarifications that are inside this designer's document, breaking them down for you, and some huge questions that the community had for how the game was supposed to work, as well as a couple clarifications and rules idiosyncrasies that we don't quite yet have a fix for, although we'll recommend some house rules to get around the failings of the core rulebook. The first one is one that I've actually spoken before at length on the channel. It's how fly interacts with vertical terrain elements. How fly has worked with terrain is entirely different in this edition from almost any edition previously. Previously, you could move over terrain without penalty, but now you're going to have to move diagonally around it. The core rules initially indicated that this was only for flying up to a higher level of terrain and flying down to a lower level of terrain, but this rules document now clarifies that that also works while flying over terrain. So we get a lot of clarification about how flying units are meant to move diagonally over terrain and exactly how to measure that for terrain that is of different heights. Essentially, if you are trying to traverse a building that you can't normally move through, a flying unit is going to measure its movement diagonally to the apex of that area, move horizontally across it, and then measure diagonally from the other side back down to the ground. Speaking of terrain, ruin line of sight was also clarified, and this was actually something that I think I and a lot of other members of the community had assumed was a typo, but it's clarified in this document that it's meant to work. Essentially, according to the core rules of the game, you can always draw a line of sight into a ruin, but you can only draw a line of sight out of or through a ruin if you are wholly within it. So this can create a situation where you could have a unit that is partially inside a piece of terrain. They can't see out of it, but because other units can see into it, they can see you. So an opposing unit can have line of sight to you while you don't have line of sight back to them. It is a little bit weird and idiosyncratic, but it is broken down in a diagram in this reference guide. So now some other more numerical changes. Multiple instances of a core ability, for example, sustained hits 1, do not stack. Instead, the rules clarify that you just choose one to use, usually the best. So if you have 2 instances of sustained hits 1, you only ever get sustained hits 1. And if you have sustained 1 and sustained 2, you're probably just going to choose the sustained 2 to use, but you don't add them together in any way. And this works for basically every keyword in the game. Characteristic and statistic modifiers have also been clarified. Importantly, many statistics can't be reduced below a threshold, and the big open question that everyone had was damage characteristics. Damage has been clarified to not be able to be reduced below 1. So all of those -1 damage abilities that we've seen across the game that don't specify a minimum damage level, they are to a minimum of 1. So you cannot be immune to 1 damage attacks. However, damage can be negated by things like the Ghost Kill Battlesuit that replaces its characteristic with a 0. So while damage can be turned to 0, it can't be subtracted to 0. Stat modifiers like this have been clarified. They round up and you add, subtract, or multiply after you do any stat replacement. This affects not only model characteristics, but also all numerical modifiers within the game. An important one that had a question mark around it were stratagems that were used for 0 command points. A lot of abilities in the game game can increase the cost of command points, and how that will work is you'll replace the cost of the stratagem with a 0, then add 1 to the cost thanks to the enemy ability, making its final cost a 1. Similarly, effects that have numerical characteristics or modifiers always round up. So, for example, if you have an ability that has the objective control characteristic of enemy models, that is going to round up and basically not affect models with an OC value of only 1 because they'll just round back up to 1. Devastating Wounds has had a ton of clarifications because how this ability worked was a little problematic. Because it inflicted mortal wounds instead of normal damage, it wasn't allocated like a normal attack, but they have been clarified to not only be affected by damage modifiers, so a weapon that has Devastating Wounds targeting a unit that reduces incoming damage is going to reduce the damage characteristic of its attack before calculating how many mortal wounds it does. In addition, those mortal wounds can be dealt to characters first if you have the precision weapon ability. We assumed that this was the intention since a lot of precision weapons also have Devastating Wounds, but because mortal wounds are assigned differently than normal damage, rules as written, you actually weren't allowed to assign the mortal wounds to a character. But according to this clarification, you in fact are. Out of phase abilities have been clarified that they cannot be used when performing actions as if it were a phase during your turn. So for example, a unit that forces battle shock checks on an opposing unit after it shoots in your shooting phase do not trigger if they shoot in any other phase. So if you overwatch during your opponent's turn, that ability would not trigger. Similarly, you can't use stratagems in any situation other than the phase that they're specified. So even if you are performing attacks as if it were your shooting phase, you're not able to use shooting phase stratagems during that attack sequence. So for example, you can't use stratagems to buff your shooting when you're firing Overwatch, and you can't tank shock when you heroically intervene on your opponent's turn. In addition, selecting to shoot and fight has been clarified as only referring to the shooting phase or fight phase respectively. This means that any stratagem or ability that triggers when a unit is selected to shoot or fight, those will only apply during the respective shoot or fight phases, whichever one the ability refers to. Similarly, this also means that they can't be used while you're performing overwatches. Now, a little bit more of a problematic one, and one that's still kind of an open question, is base versus hull measurement. Right now, there are hull measurement rules within the core rules of the game. That is to say that models that don't have bases, the core rules specify that you're meant to measure to any part of the model rather than the base itself. However, there are a lot of models with bases that in previous editions had rules that specified you used those hull measurement rules because they physically overlapped their base too much to actually be able to use the base for any meaningful function in the game. This rules document now clarifies that models that significantly overhang their base, the implication here is things like grav tanks, repulsors, impulsors, Tau hammerheads, all wildly overhang their tiny flight stands, that can't have models physically placed base to base with them because of the protrusion of their model, can use hull measurement rules instead of base measurement rules. Honestly, this rule is a little vague and kind of problematic, with a lot of awkward modeling implications. For example, it could potentially be applied to a unit that has a large size base, but maybe you modeled the unit leaning over, outstretching its arms, or it has a scenic base on it, and your opponent may be able to claim that they're going to use hull measurement to measure to that model rather than base measurement, or vice versa. There can be a lot of unintended benefits gained through the abuse of this rule. You can see my video on True Line of Sight why I think rules like these are really problematic, and I hope that this gets clarified in the future. What I would love to see is a document that breaks down which models are meant to use hull measurement versus base measurement, and theoretically the legal base size for those models, like games like Age of Sigmar have. Now with that, there are a couple clarifications that we still need, and most of these can be solved with common sense, but it's probably best for them to be codified in the rules so as not to confuse people in the future. The first one, and probably the most egregious one, is redeploy abilities. According to the designer document, these specifically happen before the first turn, after the players have deployed, but it's not specified whether or not that happens before or after the roll-off to determine first turn. That's very important because if you don't know who's going first or second, a redeploy ability isn't actually that useful, and it basically makes all of the redeployment abilities in the game extremely bad. Similarly, in the designer notes document, redeploys are stated as using the normal deployment rules to set up the unit again on the battlefield, so it's unclear whether special abilities like infiltrators that are in excess of the normal deployment rules, which is normally just wholly within your deployment zone, would work while redeploying a unit. That was an open question in 9th edition. A lot of people had different opinions on that one, and it still needs a clarification now in 10th. Transports disembarking is also an awkward one. It's never actually specified in the rules when that happens, and while the implication is that it is during the movement step of the movement phase, the disembark rules are described in the movement phase, but exactly the step in which it happens is not actually clarified. The reason that that's important is because we don't know whether or not the intention is that you're allowed to disembark units after you have brought a transport in out of reserves in your reinforcement step. It's probably safe to house rule that you can't, but it still would be nice to get a clarification. Last but certainly not least, a little bit of a pedantic one, shooting eligibility. You're eligible to shoot in the shooting phase if you haven't advanced, fallen back, and you aren't locked in combat. And in addition, if you have assault weapons and some special abilities, you can potentially even be eligible to shoot even if you have fallen back or advanced. Now, once you determine whether or not you're eligible to shoot, you can be selected to shoot in the shooting phase, but you can't be selected more than once. However, being selected to shoot doesn't actually make you ineligible. Only advancing and falling back does, according to the rules. This would theoretically allow units to do things like guide in the Tau Empire Index multiple times per turn, because they're still eligible to shoot and can continue to pick new units to guide, or perform actions based on the mission cards, even while performing ranged attacks, and clearly this is unintended. It's super safe to house rule that once a unit has performed ranged attacks, they're not eligible to perform ranged attacks again, but again, something that does need to be clarified within the rules. And with that, that is all of the important rules that you need to know out of the new rules designers document. Let me know down in the comment section if you have read through this document and if you found any tidbits or nuggets of wisdom that have changed how you've interpreted rules in 40k. I think one of my favorite ones is that they changed the psychic weapons rule to allow non-psychers to use psychic weapons, because they had printed many, especially demon units that had psychic weapons, but were not themselves psychers, and then the core rules told you couldn't use those, which was hilarious. Anyway, big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.